my side of things, which is age reversal. Is it even possible? We're going to talk about that because historically we've thought that it isn't, but I believe that it is. And then I'm going to finish up with some ideas about whether there is a path forward, a regulatory path forward, and I know that my good friend Bernie Siegel is going to be talking about that later today as well, so hopefully you'll catch that presentation. So why do we care? We care about aging because if you're over 65 years old, you have an 80% chance of developing at least one of these symptoms of aging. Whether it's cardiovascular disease, arthritis, neurodegeneration, you have a 68% chance of developing two of these symptoms. And these diseases combined that are affiliated with the aging process cost us $4.8 trillion a year. $4.8 trillion a year we're spending on the diseases that are associated with aging. That's a lot of money. And we don't seem to be doing very well, especially in the United States. So if you study longevity, if you study aging, if you're a scientist that studies aging, you're probably familiar with these hallmarks. There are several different ideas of what it means to age, whether it's cellular senescence, whether it's mitochondrial dysfunction. All of these different attributes of aging are how we sort of measure the aging process. But the problem with that is that we end up focused on our own preference, our own little niche. If we are a company that's interested in telomeres, we focus on telomeres, and if we can just fix telomeres, everything's going to be okay. Or if we are interested in mitochondrial dysfunction, we're just focusing on mitochondrial dysfunction, and if we fix that, everything's going to be okay. But what we end up dealing with is sort of like a gerontology whack-a-mole. You're trying to solve this symptom of aging, you're trying to solve this symptom of aging, you're trying to put everything in its place, and it's just not possible. Because aging isn't the way that we've understood it to be historically. We don't just age like an automobile. An automobile goes through time and it starts to rust, its brake pads start to wear out, and you think, okay, if I can replace the brake pads, if I can replace the engine, we can keep the car going. But human aging doesn't work like that. It is not as constant as we're led to believe. And you can replace a few things here and there, but ultimately, if you don't fix the fundamental problem, you're going to end up experiencing a lot of the symptoms that we talked about. So, is aging constant? I'm going to tell you that it isn't. And I'm going to give you some examples of where it isn't. Aging can be accelerated. You think that you have a birthday and now you're 1 year older and biologically you're 1 year older. That isn't necessarily the case. In species like this specific spider here, there's a process called matrophagy. And evolutionarily, a mechanism has evolved to free up resources for the next generation. So this spider, once it gives birth, once it exits the sexual mature phase of its life, its immune system crashes, its aging accelerates, and it dies in a very rapid form in order to free up resources for the next generation. It actually makes its body available to its young that they eat her. Similar for Pacific salmon. Once they spawn, they experience accelerated aging. Very similar to how we experience aging, but just on a very narrow time frame. Their tissues liquefy, they die, and they free up resources for the next generation. Evolutionarily, that's how we work too. We have an off switch that pushes us towards death in order to free up resources for the next generation. Now, we also see accelerated aging in humans, and the easiest way to see this is in space. When astronauts or cosmonauts come back from space, they often report various different ailments. And you can't really see here because it's not very clear, but you can go to the NASA website. These are all different areas that astronauts have reported accelerated aging. Eyes, their brain, their gonads, they experience this accelerated form of aging during the period they're in space. And we don't really know why. And it's not just the radiation that's up there. But human aging can be accelerated. And in fact, that causes a problem. If we're going to spend any particular time in space, we need to understand how the aging process works. Because if we're accelerating aging while we're in space, we're going to have some significant problems because that accelerated aging is associated with immune decline, just like regular aging. And this is an example of Doug Hurley. When he entered the space station in 2020, he bumped his head on the hatch. Now, that wasn't an issue for him, but if he had been on the space station for several months, it could have been a major problem because the immune system for astronauts crashes quite rapidly. And it means that they can't fight infection and they can't repair tissue as well. So that's one of the areas of my research, is trying to understand, using space as a model, how we age faster in space so that we can try to understand that underlying mechanism where typically we wouldn't have that ability to do that on Earth. So we know that there are species and mechanisms to accelerate aging. What about slowing aging? Is that possible? Well, if you're familiar with this guy, this is Jonathan. He was admitted to the Guinness Book of Records recently as the oldest terrestrial animal. In the black and white photograph, he was already 50 years old. So today he's about 200 years old. And usually the way that I try to put this into perspective is that when Jonathan was born, we had about 7 billion people on this planet. They all had experienced a lifetime. They had kids, grandkids, and they all died. Their kids, their grandkids grew up. We had about 8 billion people populating the planet. They all died. We now have about 9 billion people on the planet, and we're all aging and dying. That's 20 billion human lives that have been lost in Jonathan's lifetime. So whatever mechanism he's utilizing is something that we could certainly benefit from. We can talk about slowing aging, but what about pausing aging? Is pausing aging even a physical phenomenon in the universe we inhabit? Well, there are species that can do it. Lobsters do not age. Lobsters continue to get bigger as they get older, but they die through predation, disease, or they just get so big they can't molt anymore, and the energy expenditure is too big in order for them to get out of their shell, so they die under their own weight. But if you look at the biology of lobsters, you would never know how old a lobster is just by looking at its mitochondrial function or its cellular function. Same thing with buffalo carp. A 100-year-old buffalo carp is biologically identical to a 1-year-old buffalo carp. They're sexually fecunded. That means that they can reproduce just like a young individual can. They don't have any biological markers of aging whatsoever. They die from disease mostly and occasionally predation. But they do not have any biological markers of aging. Negligent senescence. This is what they experience. But what I find fascinating is not only can we slow aging, not only can we pause aging, but we can reverse aging. And there are several species that are alive today that can do that. One of them is Teratopsis dornii. It's also known as the immortal jellyfish. And there are jellyfish in the ocean today that scientists believe have been there for 5,000 years. Individuals. Because what they do is they're born, they reach sexual maturity, and when most species then at sexual maturity turn on the degenerative genes or turn off the regenerative genes, they de-differentiate their cells back to being a baby again, which means they take their mature cells and they turn them back into juvenile cells. They become a baby again. And they just keep doing that backwards and forwards for thousands of years, the same individual. So it exists in our universe. It exists in nature. Physics is possible to take an old cell and reverse it. In fact, we've seen it in humans. And this won the Nobel Prize in 2012. Shinya Yamanaka found these 12 factors, the Yamanaka factors, and when you use those 4 growth factors on an old skin cell, you can de-differentiate it back to an embryonic-like stem cell. So you're taking an old person's skin cell, and just with 4 growth factors, you change the biology back to being young again. You're reversing the aging of that cell. And what I find fascinating is that we see this every day, but we never really talk about it. I call this the 40 plus 40 equals 0 hypothesis. If you take a 40-year-old woman who's born with all of her eggs, if you took a 50-year-old woman, her eggs aren't really working very well anymore. A 60-year-old woman, she's unlikely to have a baby because those eggs age with her. If you're 40 years old, your eggs are 40 years old. Same thing with sperm stem cells. You make new spermatids every day, but those spermatids come from sperm stem cells that are 40 years old. And as we get older, we get wrinkly, our joints start to hurt, we experience these symptoms of aging. That's throughout our body, including these cells. That's why women can't reproduce in the age of 60 or 70 typically. But if you take a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old adult and you put those two gametes together, you put the egg and the sperm together, you make a 0-year-old baby. And that might sound silly, but if you think about it, that's kind of special. Because that means that there's a mechanism that exists in our bodies that can take 40-year-old cells and turn back the clock and make them 0 again. Because that 0-year-old baby will grow up to be an adult and have children of their own, and those cells will just keep on going. Yes, they're being renewed, but there's a mechanism that turns back the clock and gives you the ability to have cells that are 0 years old. It exists in nature. So aging isn't really what we've been told. Biological aging, how you feel, your markers of aging, are uncoupled. They can be uncoupled from chronological aging, how many birthdays you've had. And if that's the case, then that's great news for this bottom line. If we're spending $4.8 trillion on all these different symptoms of aging, imagine if we could treat aging itself as a disease. If we could understand the aging mechanism and slow it, pause it, or even reverse it, we're going to be saving trillions of dollars and we're going to be improving the health span of billions of people. So some of the experiments have already started. If you're familiar with heterochronic parabiosis, this is a set of experiments that were done at Harvard University several years ago. And what the scientists found was if you took a young mouse and an old mouse and you sutured them together so they shared a blood supply, something magical happened. The old mouse got younger. Grip strength, cognitive ability, hair color, all of these things returned because it shared something from the young individual. And back then they called them rejuvenating factors. But today we know them as exosomes. And so in my own studies, because I've been studying aging for quite some time now, over 20 years, I became very interested in this phenomenon that young tissue harbors something, whether it's the 0-year-old baby or whether it's a young mouse conveying something to the older mouse. There's something fundamental about these young tissues that can be transplanted to older tissues to see regenerative repair. And so in my own research, I was interested in cardiovascular disease and why we can't repair our hearts. Mammalian hearts don't regenerate, they don't repair. And that's why cardiovascular disease kills so many people. But there's a really interesting phenomenon that in the first 2 days of life, mammalian hearts retain this capacity to heal, just like they're in utero. When we're developing, we have this huge capacity to grow tissue and to repair tissue, but we lose it as soon as we're born. It turns off. But I'm not going to get into the details of this research. It's published there. You can read it. But what I want to tell you is that by studying the young signals that are present in those first 2 days of life, and then transplanting those young signals into a heart that was taken out of a mouse and put it in a Petri dish, I was able to keep that heart alive for over 2 weeks. And you can probably see here, it's a little hard to see, but that heart's still beating. So usually when you take a heart out of a mouse and you put it in a Petri dish, it's dying. All you're studying is necrosis. But just with the young signals that are present at birth, giving it to this tissue, I was able to maintain the tissue. But not only that, if I injured the tissue, remember, cardiac tissue does not repair, it does not regenerate. But if I took those young signals and I introduced it to a heart that was injured, I took a little nick out of the left ventricle, and I put it in a Petri dish for 21 days, the heart regenerated. So I won an award from the American Heart Association for this work. It's been featured on the cover of Circulation Research. You're welcome to read it. But if you look at the data here, the bottom panel, the EDU, where it says EDU on the bottom, that little triangle that's red, that's proliferating cells. That's heart cells regenerating an injury that hasn't been seen before. Because as soon as you're born, your heart and your other tissues lose the ability to repair and regenerate. But just by providing those young signals, was I able to induce repair. So we were the first to publish on this. This idea is that pregnancy, as a theme, pregnancy is a natural form of heterochronic parabiosis. You take a young individual and an old individual that are sharing a blood supply. And what's interesting is that in that blood supply are exosomes, and those exosomes are generated by the fetal kidneys. They accumulate in the amniotic fluid. And when you've heard the idea that pregnant women glow, the contributing factor to that is her access to amniotic fluid. It's flowing through her circulatory system. This amniotic fluid that the baby is sitting in and is producing, and all these exosomes, all these growth factors. And during a full-term cesarean section, when the baby's born, we're able to harvest that amniotic fluid. We're able to purify it. We're able to take those exosomes, those growth factors, the hyaluronic acid, the chondroitin sulfate, all of these things that in the literature have been demonstrated to be critical for anti-aging and longevity and health span. They're all accumulating in the amniotic fluid. We can purify that in our CGMP-compliant lab, and we can transplant it. I'm going to show you now some examples of what happens when we transplant that amniotic fluid. So let's talk about skin for a minute. We'll focus on skin when we talk about regeneration. So this is a quote from Dennis Orgill at Harvard University. As you've probably figured out already in your own experience, the body's capacity to repair skin diminishes as we get older. His explanation is that there just aren't as many growth factors and stem cells in the skin anymore. So when you're young, you heal very fast. As you get older, you lose that ability to heal. This goes back to what I was talking about before. In utero, your body has this huge capacity to repair and regenerate. That yellow bar, if you can't see from the back, is teen years. Then we have 30, 50, and 60 years. As soon as we're born, we precipitously lose that ability to repair and regenerate tissue. Our bodies are preparing to exit us. It's an off switch. Biologically, we need an off switch to get rid of us out of the gene pool. And it starts at birth. It accelerates at when we stop growing, it accelerates at puberty, it accelerates at menopause, and accelerates in our 60s as well. But as soon as we're born, we lose this ability to repair and regenerate. But what if we take those young signals, we purify that amniotic fluid, we take those exosomes, we take those growth factors, can we do something like the Yamanaka factors where we trick the old skin, the old cells into thinking they're younger and allow them to use those resources to heal themselves? So we started with a very simple experiment. This is called a wound healing assay. We use epithelial cells, so the cells that would typically respond to an injury, and we culture them in a Petri dish. We put a little bit of gel in the middle of the Petri dish, and we let the cells reach what we call confluence. That means that the entire bottom of the plate is full of cells. We remove that piece of gel, and you have a circle where there are no cells. Now, if you do nothing, those cells are senescent. They don't do anything. They sit there, and then eventually they will die. But if you add these growth factors, if you add this purified amniotic fluid, and we call it VIX-001, and I'll explain that in a minute, when we take VIX-001, our proprietary fraction of amniotic fluid, and add it to those cells, they activate, and they migrate. So this is the first indication that whatever's in this amniotic fluid isn't just junk, it isn't just fluid that the baby floats in. There are bioactive materials in this material that can respond, get cells to respond to them. So that's in vitro, that's in a Petri dish, but what about in vivo? What about in animals? So we did another assay in collaboration with Harvard University, where we injured the back of mice. Now, mice heal very fast anyway, so it's actually quite hard to do a wound healing assay in mice because they really want to heal anyway. But if you can accelerate that healing process, that really demonstrates that you're onto something. And what we found here was that if we took VIX-001, so the purified amniotic fluid, or we took another product from birth tissue called Wharton's jelly, which is the substance you find in the umbilical cord, and you add that to the injury, you can accelerate the healing process. On the bottom panel there is just saline. You can see some healing happening. But in the top two panels, you can see that with those products, you're accelerating the healing process. So where the adult tissue would usually be slow, it is now fast. This is some human data now. So we've gone from Petri dish, in vitro, to small animals, now into human studies. This is a case of diabetic ulcers. And if you're familiar with diabetic ulcers, you'll know that generally they're refractory to treatment. If you develop a diabetic ulcer, it's going to continue to get bigger. You can't revascularize. No treatments work. It's going to end in amputation. So this was an ulcer on the outside of the foot, completely refractory to any other form of treatment. We took the proprietary fraction, VIX-001, and we applied it topically. And over the course of 2 months, it revascularized. The tissue grew back, and there was no scarring. Baby soft skin, no scarring, no disease. There's another example. This is the Achilles tendon. Again, accelerating diabetic ulcer. Nothing in conventional medicine was helping. This guy was hospitalized for a heart attack, but they weren't able to treat his diabetic ulcer. We applied the product topically. We put a Band-Aid over the top over the course of 3 months. Yes, it took some time because these lesions do not want to heal. But with the power of this amniotic fluid product, over the course of 3 months, we were able to reduce the pain immediately. That was a big thing. And then heal it over 3 months. Baby soft skin, revascularized, no scarring. This is an example of a thermal burn. So this patient was hit by a firework on the back of the leg. She received 2nd and 3rd degree burns. She was in 10 out of 10 pain. She was immediately on opioids, which, as you know, is a major problem for the United States. We have a huge epidemic of an opioid crisis right now. She happened to work at a clinic that had access to this purified amniotic fluid. They sprayed it on top of her wound. And instead of 2 to 3 months recovery, which is what the doctor was predicting, this is the result in 6 days. We convinced the skin that it was young. We gave it the resources that young tissue has access to, which old skin does not. And the adult skin was able to utilize those and heal much faster. She went from 10 out of 10 pain into 2 out of 10 pain within 30 minutes. She was off opioids. She was able to shower. They were able to debride. We've published this work. You're welcome to read it. I'm happy to share it. This is autoimmune disease. So again, as you get older, your immune system crashes. It becomes dysregulated. This patient was like this for 5 years. Red skin syndrome, also known as steroid withdrawal syndrome. Her legs, her arms, her face were red raw like this for 5 years. Nothing in conventional medicine was helping her. She had an IV dose. This is her feet 1 week later. That's her arm 2 weeks later. Now, she did revert. She did have to get treated again. But after the course of a year, she was in complete remission, and now her life has been regained. Amniotic fluid is not only very regenerative, it's not only immunomodulatory, it's also very antimicrobial. So in this case, we have it up there as pyoderma gangrenosum. It was never officially diagnosed as such, but suffice it to say, this patient had a very severe reaction to a dog bite. It became infected, and she was an amputation candidate. They were about to cut off her leg. Nothing was helping her. No antibiotics, nothing. We gave her a topical dose. Not me, the physicians. Over the course of a month, not only did we reverse the infection, but also we regenerated the tissue and saved the leg. So I'm going to give you one more example, medical example, then I'm going to move on to the last part of the talk, which is where do we go from here? This was a stroke patient, 4 years post-stroke before going to IMAC regeneration centers. He was completely akinetic, spastic on his left arm and left leg, completely unable to move it for 4 years. He came into the clinic, they gave him an IV dose of the purified amniotic fluid fraction, and we don't seem to have any audio, but that's probably fine. It's okay if we don't. In the first video there, what we would have heard was the
Well,
excitement.
we'll call mom and dad from the car.
Yeah, let me start that again. Just so
Oh, I'm so excited for you, Dave. I never expected to see this that quickly. You just don't know what to expect
Right, so
sometimes.
what you're not seeing there is much movement.
We'll call
But he's
Mom
telling
and
his
Dad
wife he thinks he
from
can
the
feel
car
his toes for the first time.
on the way home.
And we were all like, this doesn't seem possible. That can't be regenerative medicine. It's way too soon. It doesn't make any sense. Maybe it's all in his head. It's a placebo effect. But then the next day, they sent us this video.
Wait, do it again.
That's 1 day later. 3
What's about
days
your ankle
later,
this morning?
3 days later, they sent this video. Right? So, do I believe that's regenerative medicine? No, I don't. But I believe that it's immunomodulation. It turns out that his brain was inflamed. And with that inflammation, he was unable to send signals to his extremities, and his physician had no idea. So this guy was completely paralyzed for 4 years without knowing that there was a potential treatment out there for him. And just right away, that patient became ambulatory after 4 years, completely paralyzed. So how does that work? How does it all work? We have no idea right now. You know, and I use the analogy all the time of breast milk. We've been studying breast milk, scientists, not myself. We've been studying breast milk for decades, and we still don't know everything that's in it. We can't recreate breast milk. We can make formula, but it's not the same thing. Amniotic fluid, this particular fraction, VIX001 that we manufacture, we don't really know what it's doing. But we know that there are 400 billion exosomes per cc. We know there's over 300 bioactive growth factors. We know that there's hyaluronic acid. We know that there's chondroitin sulfate. We know all of these things, and we just discovered recently that it's robust in its expression of chlortho. Now, if you're in the field of longevity and regenerative medicine, chlortho is a big word right now. It's a gene that dictates longevity. And it's manufactured by the fetal kidneys. And so it's abundant in purified amniotic fluid, and particularly our fraction VIX001. Chlortho, if you knock it out in a mouse, the mouse dies very rapidly. If you overexpress it, it lives much longer. Has a healthier health span and a longer lifespan. Is this part of the mechanism? Possibly. We're still trying to understand what the mechanism is, but it's very exciting to know that all of these different longevity components are present in amniotic fluid, and that's what contributes to the pregnancy of the mother. It improves her physiology during the rigors of pregnancy. It helps the baby grow, but also we're able to transplant it and see those effects in individuals, unrelated individuals. So is there a path forward? I know I'm running out of time, but I'm going to try to wrap this up. Is there a path forward? Well, we've been working very diligently. We have an IND approved by the FDA for a clinical trial using VIX001. So we're very excited about that. If you know anything about the IND process, you know that it's incredibly rigorous. It's very difficult to get an approval by the FDA for a clinical trial. So you're welcome to look up that clinical trial if you'd like to know more information. I've been working with different groups about how we get patient better access to these kinds of modalities. In the Bahamas, recently, they just passed a new law. In fact, it went into effect on September 4th of last year, allowing regenerative medicine, these kinds of products, to be practiced in the Bahamas in the absence of FDA approval. You have to have a license, you have to work with the government, but for one of the first times in our history, a government has recognized the potential of these technologies and allowed physicians to have access to them without FDA approval. If anybody's familiar with this gentleman, this is Brigham Bueller. If you haven't seen his podcast, if you haven't seen him on Joe Rogan, I suggest you Google that right away. He's got maybe 4 or 5 different interviews on the Joe Rogan show. He talks about the broken healthcare system in the United States. Incredibly smart guy, also went and testified to the Senate, and he's helping RFK Jr. in the transition to try to educate the FDA on how to regulate these products so that we get them in front of patients, but we still maintain safety. That's a big issue. So there's a lot moving and shaking in this industry right now. I'm also an advisor for A4LI, which is the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives. We have a bipartisan caucus to promote longevity research. This is a huge deal. This is decision makers, lawmakers agreeing that there is a way forward, that we need to understand the aging process if we're going to understand human disease. Utah is the first state to pass a law to allow regenerative medicine, allow exosomes, allow stem cell biology, allow these kinds of modalities to be practiced by physicians in the absence of FDA approval. Other states are close on their heels. But we're undergoing a major change right now. So with this new administration, we have RFK coming in. He's a huge proponent, as you know, of making the United States healthy. And one way we can do that is by tapping into these modalities that typically we haven't had access to. So Jim O'Neill is going to be part of his team. Jim used to be the CEO of the SENS Research Foundation, and their goal is to study longevity and aging. Marty is going to be coming in as the new FDA director, and he's very supportive of regenerative medicine, stem cell biology, and exosomes. So the entire industry is about to change, and you guys are here at the forefront of it today at this conference. So if we're going to spend $4.8 trillion on studying all these different symptoms of aging, wouldn't it make sense to understand aging as a disease? The CDC doesn't recognize aging as a disease. But if we recognize it as a disease and we study it like a disease, perhaps we could study it upstream. Neobiosis is focused on understanding what causes the aging process. If we could slow, pause, or reverse human aging with some of these modalities, with these young signals that we're tapping into, perhaps we can completely eliminate all of these symptoms that are causing this huge $4.8 trillion expenditure. So I'm affiliated with several different organizations. Neobiosis is where we manufacture the products, but I'm also the founder of SARI. SARI has a team for the new X Prize. There's a $101 million purse for discovering a modality that's going to reverse aging. So if anybody's interested in the research behind longevity and anti-aging, feel free to check out my website. It's spaceaging.org. Happy to talk about the X Prize. I'm not sure if we're taking any questions, but I'm happy. No, we're not taking any questions. But I'm going to be around, so if anybody does have any questions, feel free to reach me later. Thank you. And I will just quickly say, if you're new to regenerative medicine and this was a little bit overwhelming for you, I brought a few copies of this magazine. So I was asked by Top Doctor magazine to write a few articles for them, introducing exosomes, regenerative medicine. I have a few copies of this, so if you want one, then please come and see me and I'll be happy to give you one.